Arriving at the scene of the battle, I evaluated the situation to see how I would take action against these foreign invaders. The Japanese ambush was proving successful and His Majesty's troops were being forced into retreat. The man leading the king's forces was none other than the armory captain I met just a few days before. He was calling out orders and organizing his men, trying to get them to safety. But the Japanese forces were rapidly gaining on them. The outcome was not looking so good. Suddenly the armory captain stopped in his tracks and looked back at the advancing army. His eyes scanning the battlefield, soaking up the visions of a lost battle. His face showed the heavy loss of many men from his battalion. And then, his expression changed as he started to focus on one of the events taking place at the rear of the retreat. The gift bestowed on me by the mantis of heightened senses not only allowed me to observe the armory captain's position, but I could also see and hear everything taking place around me in amazing detail. The armory captain cautiously taking a single step back towards the approaching enemy, apparently he is considering a return to the massacre he left behind. His focus was on a small group of men preparing to engage in a fight to the death. 3 Japanese warriors, 2 armed with swords and another armed with a spear. They were encircled around a large man holding his sword in a defensive posture, standing his ground. It quickly became clear to me the conflict within the armory captain's mind. The decision to continue to retreat or to return to face the overwhelming enemy forces. The large man was in fact his friend, the quiet giant. I can only imagine the anguish he felt watching his friend facing off against such insurmountable odds. The 2 Japanese swordsmen stood before him, advancing cautiously as the man with the spear slipped in behind him, thrusting the tip of his bladed polearm into the shoulder of the large man, forcing him to the ground on one knee before the 2 approaching swordsmen. As one of the swordsmen lifted his blade to inflict his fatal stroke to the man on his knee, I decided that this would be a good place for me to start my intervention. I called out to the men as I approached them, rapidly and confidently preparing to take matters into my own hands. And if all goes well, to save the man that once showed kindness to me. Before the swordsman started his downstroke, the man standing next to him poked him in the chest to get his attention and then pointed at me as I prepared to engage with the 3 of them. Turning his blade and attention towards me, he prepared to make his attack. The look in his eyes and smug smirk on his face indicated he was certain he could defeat me. And yet here I was, never have I ever been in battle or even a fight. Here I was, standing my ground. Inwardly knowing I would be victorious. The Japanese attacker raised his sword over his head with deadly intent. He then lunged towards me to engage. Calmly, I reached back and released the iron clasps retaining my swords, pulling them forward, preparing my defense. As his sword began its downstroke towards the top of my head, I raised my right arm and sword, exposing the iron barbs on the forearm of my armor, preparing to deflect the cutting blow. As his sword made contact with my forearm, I looped the inner edge of my sword over his wrist, trapping his weapon, and then stepping in behind him I hooked my left sword over his shoulder. Pulling him in tight, restraining him from further attack. Then, spinning him clockwise with great force and sending his body mass towards the ground. With his body in motion, I released the grip my swords had on my opponent and changing my direction. I aligned the angle of my edged weapon with his throat as he fell uncontrollably in the direction of my blade. And before he could even blink, his headless body dropped at my feet behind me. I didn't have to turn around to verify this fact. I just knew it was so. The attack and defense only took a few seconds. But to me, the event passed slowly as I absorbed every element of the engagement. I could hear everything from the gravel shifting under his feet to the swish of his blade as it traveled through the air. I could see all that was before and behind me. And as I prepared to engage the other 2 warriors, I could see that the retreating army was taking notice of the events transpiring between us. This could change the course of history.